He crossed 3 counties with blood in his pocket and her name on a slip of paper. The blood wasn't his, but the name felt like it might be. A branding iron he couldn't see but felt sizzling under his ribs. Ren Alder, Carrion Ridge. The words were a map to a place no decent man would go, and a woman no decent man would know. Silas Ketch was not a decent man. He was a tool sharpened by silence, honed by the dry rasp of a gun hammer, and paid for in coins that felt heavy as gravestones. The man who'd hired him, a banker with a tremor in his hand and sweat on his upper lip, had called it a simple matter. "My cousin," he'd said, his voice a reedy whisper in the back of a dusty saloon. "He's a brute. She needs him gone." Quietly. The banker, whose name Silas had already forgotten, had slid a leather pouch across the table. Half now, half when the deed was done. The pouch was in his saddlebag, a dead weight that mirrored the one in his gut. The trail to Carrion Ridge was a liar. It started wide and forgiving, a dusty artery bleeding out from the last town, but soon it thinned to a pale scar winding through cracked earth and skeletal trees. The air grew thin and sharp, tasting of pine and something else, something older and colder. Buzzards circled high overhead, their shadows like ink blots on the vast, bleached canvas of the sky. They were the only welcome party on this road. Silas rode with his hat pulled low, his face a mask of sun-cracked leather and indifference. He'd learned long ago that a man's face was a ledger, and his was best kept blank. Inside, though, a quiet hum of anticipation had started, a low thrumming that was part of the job. It was the feeling of a lock about to turn, a secret about to be spilled. He was the key. The homestead wasn't much. A cabin of dark, weathered logs slumped against a hillside, as if tired of standing. A curl of smoke, pale as a ghost, rose from the stone chimney, a fragile signal of life in a landscape that seemed dedicated to death. A single horse, a sway-backed mare, stood listlessly in a small corral. There were no other signs of life. No chickens scratching in the yard, no dog barking a warning. Just the wind, a lonely mourner sifting through the dry grass. And the silence. It was a different kind of silence than the one he carried inside him. His was a chosen quiet, a shield. This was an ancient, listening silence, heavy with things unsaid. He dismounted, his boots sinking into the soft earth. The porch steps groaned under his weight, a sound loud as a gunshot in the stillness. He stopped at the door, a heavy plank of wood scarred by time and weather. The slip of paper with her name on it felt hot in his pocket, a coal against his skin. He raised a hand to knock, but before his knuckles could touch the wood, the door creaked open. And there she was. Ren Alder. She wasn't what he'd expected. He'd pictured a woman cowed by fear, her eyes hollowed out, her body stooped with the weight of abuse. The woman in the doorway was not that. She was tall, slender but strong, with a cascade of dark hair pulled back from a face that was all sharp angles and defiant curves. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sky, held no fear. They held something else. A flicker of recognition, a spark of challenge. She wore a simple homespun dress, the sleeves rolled up to her elbows, revealing forearms dusted with flour. The air that drifted out from the cabin was warm and rich, thick with the smell of simmering stew and wood smoke. She smiled, a slow, knowing curve of her lips that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You're late," she said, her voice low and smoky, like whiskey poured over embers. Silas's hand fell from the door. The hum inside him sharpened, the frequency changing from anticipation to alarm. "I don't know what you mean, ma'am." Her smile widened, but it was a predator's smile, all teeth and hidden promises. "Don't you? A man like you, riding all this way? You're not here to sell Bibles." She stepped back, holding the door open wider, an invitation that felt more like a summons. "The stew's ready. I was beginning to think you weren't coming." He hesitated, his instincts screaming at him. This was wrong. All of it. The welcoming smell, the lack of fear, the unnerving confidence in her eyes. A job like this was supposed to be a shadow play, a quiet intrusion, a clean exit. It wasn't supposed to start with a dinner invitation, but turning back now was not an option. He had half the money, and his reputation was built on finishing what he started. He stepped over the threshold, into the warm, fragrant darkness of the cabin. The inside was a single room, clean and spare. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a pot bubbling merrily over a low flame. A rough-hewn table stood in the center of the room, set for two plates, 2 cups, 2 sets of cutlery. One of the chairs was pushed back as if its occupant had just left. A half-eaten plate of food sat before it, the gravy already congealing. On the floor, near the hearth, was a pair of muddy boots, kicked off in a hurry. Silas's gaze swept the room, cataloging the details, searching for the man he'd been sent to kill. He wasn't there. "Where's your husband?" Silas asked, his voice flat, betraying none of the unease coiling in his stomach. Wren followed his gaze to the empty chair, to the half-eaten meal. A shadow passed over her face, a fleeting cloud across a summer sky. "He had to leave," she said, her voice losing some of its edge, softening into something that might have been sorrow. Unexpectedly. She moved to the fireplace, her movements fluid and graceful, like a cat. She picked up a ladle and stirred the stew, the rich, savory scent filling the small space. "I made too much," she said, not looking at him. "It seems a shame to let it go to waste." She turned, the ladle dripping, and her eyes found his again, the storm clouds gathering once more. "You must be hungry after your ride." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, a thread in the web she was weaving around him. He was hungry. The trail had been long, and the last town was a day's ride behind him. But the food on the table, the stew in the pot, felt like a trap. Every instinct told him to refuse, to draw his gun and demand answers. But her gaze held him, a strange mix of vulnerability and steel. He felt a pull toward her, a dangerous curiosity that overrode his professional caution. He wanted to understand the game she was playing. He wanted to know why the chair was empty and the boots were by the fire. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "I could eat." Her smile returned, genuine this time, and it transformed her face, softening the sharp edges, making her almost beautiful. "Good," she said. "Sit. I'll serve you." He moved to the table, his spurs ringing softly on the wooden floor. He didn't take the empty chair. He took the other one, the one that faced the door, his back to the wall. It was a habit he'd never broken, a rule for a life lived on the edge. He placed his hat on the floor beside him and rested his hands on the table, his fingers inches from the worn leather of his holster. Wren brought him a plate piled high with thick, dark stew, the meat and vegetables swimming in a rich gravy. Steam rose from it, carrying the scent of herbs and slow-cooked beef. She placed it in front of him, her fingers brushing his as she set it down. Her touch was light, accidental, but it sent a jolt through him, a spark of warmth that was both pleasant and deeply unsettling. He hadn't felt a woman's touch in years, not a gentle one anyway. She sat opposite him, in the chair her husband had apparently vacated. She didn't serve herself. She just watched him, her chin resting on her hand, her eyes dark and unreadable. The firelight danced across her face, casting shifting shadows that made it impossible to know what she was thinking. "You're a long way from home," she said, her voice a low murmur. "I don't have a home," he replied, his voice rough. He picked up his fork and took a bite of the stew. It was delicious. The meat was tender, the vegetables perfectly cooked, the gravy rich and complex. There was a faint, salty tang to it, a flavor he couldn't quite place. He took another bite, then another. The warmth of the food spread through him, chasing away the chill of the trail, lulling his senses. He was aware of the danger, of the strangeness of the situation, but the stew was a powerful opiate. "Everyone has a home," she said softly, "even if it's just a memory." He didn't answer. He just ate, his eyes never leaving hers. He was trying to read her, to find the lie in her gaze, the crack in her composure. But she was a locked room, and he didn't have the key. He finished the stew, scraping the plate clean. He felt a strange sense of contentment, a fullness that was more than just physical. It was as if he'd been starving for something more than food. She reached across the table and refilled his cup with water from a clay pitcher. "More?" she asked, her voice a silken whisper. He shook his head. "That was fine, ma'am." He pushed the plate away and leaned back in his chair, his hand once again resting near his gun. The warmth of the food was making him drowsy, his guard slipping. He forced himself to focus, to remember why he was here. "About your husband." "Abel," she supplied, her voice flat. "His name was Abel." Was. The past tense hung in the air between them, heavy and cold. "You said he had to leave." "I did." She looked down at her hands, which were clasped on the table. Her knuckles were white. "There was a disagreement. He won't be coming back." Silas's eyes narrowed. "A disagreement?" She looked up, and her eyes were filled with a sudden raw pain that took his breath away. It was the first genuine emotion he'd seen from her, and it was a devastating one. "He was not a kind man, Mr. Ketch." She knew his name. The slip of paper in his pocket felt like it was burning a hole through his clothes. The banker. The banker must have told her his name. But why? Why would a man hiring a killer tell the target's wife the killer's name? Unless the wife was the one doing the hiring. The thought hit him with the force of a physical blow. He'd been played. The banker, with his trembling hands and sweaty lip, was just a messenger. The money, the instructions, had come from her. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw it all. The strength, the defiance, the simmering rage beneath the calm surface. She wasn't a victim. She was a survivor, and she had hired him not to kill her husband, but for something else entirely. "He's dead, isn't he?" Silas asked, his voice a low growl. "Abel, he's already dead." Wren didn't flinch. She just held his gaze, her own unwavering. She gave a single, slow nod. "He is." The stew in his stomach turned to lead. The warmth he'd felt moments before was gone, replaced by an icy dread. He had walked into a trap, a game he didn't understand, with rules he didn't know. The half-eaten meal, the empty chair, the boots by the fire. It was all a stage, set for his arrival. "Where is he?" Silas demanded, his hand closing around the butt of his pistol. She didn't seem to notice the threat. Her gaze drifted to the window, to the darkening landscape outside. "He's where he can't hurt anyone ever again." She looked back at Silas, and her eyes were pleading now, the storm clouds breaking. "I didn't know what else to do. He was going to kill me. It was him or me." The story came out in a torrent, a flood of words held back for too long. Abel's rages, his fists, the fear she lived with every day. She spoke of the isolation, the loneliness, the feeling of being trapped on this God-forsaken ridge with a man who was more monster than human. She told him how Abel had found out about the money she'd inherited, a small sum her father had left her, and how he'd been trying to beat it out of her. "Last night," she whispered, her voice cracking, "he came at me with a knife. I hit him. With the cast-iron skillet." She shuddered, a tremor running through her body. "He fell. He just fell, and he didn't get up." Silas listened, his face impassive, but inside, a storm of his own was brewing. He'd killed men for money, for reasons far less compelling than this. He'd taken lives without a second thought, without a flicker of remorse. But this was different. This was a woman pushed to the edge, a life taken in desperation, not cold blood. And he was now a part of it, tangled in her story, whether he wanted to be or not. "So you sent for me," he said, the pieces clicking into place. "Why? To get rid of the body?" She shook her head, a tear tracing a path through the flower on her cheek. "No, I took care of that. I buried him, out by the old oak tree." She took a deep, shuddering breath. "I sent for you because of them." "Them?" "Abel's family," she said, her voice dropping to a fearful whisper. "His brother, his cousins. They're worse than he was. They live a county over, but they ride through here sometimes. They know about my money. When Abel doesn't show up, they'll come looking for him. And when they find him, they'll kill me." The banker, not her cousin. Abel's cousin. The man had hired Silas to kill Abel, but Wren had gotten there first. Now she needed a protector, a hired gun to stand between her and the wrath of Abel's family. The job hadn't changed, not really. The target was just different. Instead of one man, it was a whole family of them. "You want me to stay?" he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "You want me to fight them for you?" "I'll pay you," she said, her voice desperate. "I'll give you all the money, just stay. Please, I can't do this alone." He should have said no. He should have stood up, walked out the door, and ridden away without looking back. This was not his fight. He was a killer, not a bodyguard. He dealt in endings, not beginnings. But he didn't move. He just sat there, looking at her, at the raw, desperate hope in her eyes. He saw a reflection of himself in her, a fellow survivor in a world that was determined to crush them. He had been alone his whole life, wrapped in a cocoon of silence and violence. For the first time, he felt a crack in that cocoon, a sliver of light getting in. He thought of the money in his saddlebag, the other half he was owed. He thought of the long, empty road ahead of him, the string of nameless towns and faceless men that was his future. And then he looked at Wren, at the woman who had killed her husband with a skillet and was now offering him a plate of stew and a reason to stay. He didn't know why he did it. Maybe it was the stew. Maybe it was the weariness in his bones. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the flicker of something in her eyes that he hadn't seen in a long, long time. Something that looked a little like home. "All right," he heard himself say, the word a stranger on his own tongue. "I'll stay." The relief that washed over her face was so profound, it was like watching the sun rise. The tears came freely now, not of sorrow, but of gratitude. She didn't thank him, not with words. She just looked at him, her eyes shining, and in that moment, he felt a bond form between them, a silent pact forged in violence and sealed with a promise. He had come to Carrion Ridge to take a life. Now, it seemed, he was here to save one. And in doing so, he had a sinking feeling he was about to lose his own. Not his life, perhaps, but something far more valuable. The emptiness that had kept him safe for so long was beginning to fill up, and he was terrified of what might grow in that newly fertile ground. The days that followed fell into a strange, unsettling rhythm. Silas became a ghost in his own life, a sentinel on the edge of Wren's world. He took the small, windowless storeroom at the back of the cabin for his own, a space that smelled of dried herbs and dust. He slept on a pallet on the floor, his gun beside him, his ears attuned to the slightest sound in the night. He woke before dawn each day, the habit of a lifetime, and would stand on the porch, watching the sun bleed over the ridge, the buzzards circling in the pale morning light. He was waiting. They were all waiting. Wren moved around him with a quiet grace, a woman reclaiming her own space. She cleaned the cabin with a fierce energy, scrubbing away the last traces of Abel's presence. She aired out his clothes, his blankets, and then, in a small private ceremony that Silas watched from a distance, She burned them in a barrel behind the cabin. The smoke rose thick and black, a final, acrid farewell. She cooked for him, simple, hearty meals that tasted of the earth and her own quiet strength. They ate in silence, the empty chair at the table a constant, unspoken presence. Sometimes he would catch her staring at it, her eyes distant, her thoughts 1,000 miles away. He never asked what she was thinking. He didn't want to know. He was a hired gun, a temporary fixture in her life. He was here to do a job, and then he would be gone. That was the agreement. That was the line he had to maintain. But the line was beginning to blur. He found himself watching her as she worked, the way her hair came loose from its pins and fell across her face, the determined set of her jaw as she kneaded dough, the small, unconscious smile that touched her lips when she tended her small garden, a patch of stubborn green she was coaxing from the dry, unforgiving soil. He was a man who had built his life on not noticing things, on keeping his distance. But with Ren, he couldn't seem to help himself. He was noticing everything. One afternoon, he was cleaning his rifle on the porch, the familiar weight of the steel and wood a comfort in his hands. She came and sat on the steps near him, a basket of mending in her lap. She didn't speak for a long time, just the soft snip of her scissors and the rhythmic click of his cleaning rod. "You're good with your hands," she said, her voice soft. He grunted in response, not looking up. "My father was a gunsmith," she went on, her voice wistful. "He taught me how to shoot. He said a woman on her own needed to know how to protect herself." Silas paused, his hands stilling. He looked at her. "Where's your father now?" A shadow crossed her face. "He passed a few years back. He never met Abel. I'm glad for that. He wouldn't have liked him." "No," Silas said, his voice flat. "I don't suppose he would have." She looked at the rifle in his hands, her eyes lingering on the polished stock. "That's a fine piece. It does the job." "Abel had a rifle," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He kept it behind the flour bin. He was so proud of it. He used to say it could shoot the wings off a fly." She gave a small, bitter laugh. "He never used it for hunting, though, just for threatening." Silas felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He thought of the rifle, hidden away, a silent testament to the terror she had endured. He wondered if she had ever thought of using it herself. "I found it after," she said, as if reading his mind. "I took it out to clean it. And I found this." She reached into her mending basket and pulled out a small, heavy object. She held it out to him on the palm of her hand. It was a bullet. But instead of a lead tip, it was a silver dime, hammered and shaped to fit the casing. Silas stared at it, a chill running down his spine. A dime, a silver dime. He'd heard stories, old tales from the backwoods, of men who loaded their guns with silver, believing it could kill things that lead couldn't. Demons, wendigos, things born of darkness and fear. "There were more," she said, her voice trembling. "The whole rifle was loaded with them." He looked from the strange, misshapen bullet to her face, and he saw a fear there that went deeper than just a fear of Abel's family. It was an old fear, a primal fear of something he couldn't name. "What was he afraid of, Ren?" he asked, his voice low. She shook her head, her eyes wide and haunted. "I don't know. He used to talk in his sleep, about the ridge, about something that lived up here, something that watched him." She wrapped her arms around herself, as if warding off a chill. "He said it was a debt collector, that it had come for what it was owed." Silas looked out at the ridge, at the jagged peaks that clawed at the sky. He'd seen a lot of strange things in his life, but this was something else. A rifle loaded with dimes, a man haunted by a debt collector from the darkness. He felt like he had stumbled into a story that had started long before he arrived, a story written in blood and fear. He took the silver bullet from her hand, its weight cold and heavy in his own. He didn't believe in demons or spirits. He believed in men and the evil they were capable of. But as he looked at the dime, at the face of Lady Liberty worn smooth by time, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something else at play here, something ancient and hungry that lived in the shadows of Carrion Ridge. And he and Wren were standing right in its path. The waiting stretched on, a wire pulled taut. Every sunrise brought with it a fresh wave of tension, a renewed sense of impending violence. Silas patrolled the homestead like a caged wolf, his senses on high alert, his hand never far from his gun. He checked the perimeter, looked for tracks, for any sign that they were being watched. He found nothing, just the wind and the birds and the crushing silence. The silence was the worst part. It gave him too much time to think. He thought about Wren, about the secrets she still held behind her stormy eyes. He thought about Abel, buried out by the old oak tree, a man he had been paid to kill but had never met. And he thought about the rifle loaded with dimes, a puzzle he couldn't solve. He and Wren fell into a domesticity that was both comforting and deeply unnerving. They worked side by side, a silent team, their movements choreographed by unspoken understanding. He chopped wood, she stacked it. He drew water from the well, she heated it for washing. He repaired the fence around the corral, she brought him a cool drink when the sun was high. They were like a married couple, playing house on the edge of the world. The thought was a dangerous one, and he pushed it away every time it surfaced. He was not that man. He could never be that man. One evening, after a particularly tense day, when a lone rider had passed on the distant trail, sending them both scrambling for cover, they sat at the table, the stew between them untouched. The air was thick with unspoken fear. "Tell me about him," Wren said suddenly, her voice cutting through the silence. Silas looked up, his eyes questioning. "The man who hired you," she clarified. "The banker, Abel's cousin." Silas shrugged. "Not much to tell. He was a small man, scared, paid me half up front. And the other half? When the job was done." She looked at him, her gaze intense. "The job is done. Abel is dead." "Not the job he hired me for," Silas said, his voice hard. "He hired me to kill Abel. You did that yourself." "So you won't get the other half," she stated, a strange note in her voice. "No, that's not fair," she said, a flash of anger in her eyes. "You're still here. You're still risking your life. It's not about the money, Wren." The words were out before he could stop them. He didn't know why he'd said it. It was a lie. It had always been about the money. That was the only thing that made sense in his world. She stared at him, her eyes searching his face. "Then what is it about?" He didn't have an answer. He looked away, out the window at the twilight bleeding across the sky. He felt her hand on his, her fingers cool and light. He flinched, but he didn't pull away. "I know what it's like to be alone," she said softly. "To feel like you're invisible, like no one would even notice if you were gone." He looked back at her, and in the depths of her eyes, he saw a loneliness that mirrored his own. It was a raw, aching thing, a wound that had never healed. He had spent his life cultivating his solitude, using it as a shield. But looking at her, he realized that it was also a prison. He cleared his throat, the sound rough in the quiet room. "You're not alone anymore, Wren." A small, sad smile touched her lips. "Neither are you, Silas." Her name on his tongue, his on hers. It was a small thing, but it felt significant, a shift in the landscape between them. They were no longer just a client and a hired gun. They were two people, bound together by a shared secret and a common enemy. Later that night, he was woken by a sound. A soft, rhythmic thudding. He was on his feet in an instant, his gun in his hand, his heart pounding. He moved silently to the door of his storeroom and listened. The sound was coming from the main room. It was the sound of a knife hitting a cutting board. He pushed the door open a crack and peered out. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint red glow on the room. Wren was at the table, a single candle burning beside her. She was chopping vegetables, her movements precise and methodical. But it was the cutting board that held his attention. It was an old, scarred piece of wood, dark with age and use, and in the center of it, burned deep into the grain, was a perfect circle, a ring. The ghost of a wedding band, seared into the wood by heat and time. He watched her, mesmerized. She seemed oblivious to his presence, lost in her own world. The knife rose and fell, a steady, relentless rhythm. Chop, chop, chop. It was a soothing sound, a domestic sound, but in the dead of night, with the ghost of a wedding ring on the cutting board, it felt like something else entirely. It felt like a ritual, a penance, or a preparation. He slipped back into his room, his mind reeling. The woman was a labyrinth of secrets and sorrows. Every time he thought he had found his way, he turned a corner and found another locked door. The rifle with the dimes, the burned-in wedding ring, the husband buried under the oak tree. He was in over his head, drowning in a story he couldn't read. A few days later, they came. Silas saw them first. 3 riders cresting the ridge at dawn, their silhouettes black against the fiery sky. They moved slowly, deliberately, their horses picking their way down the treacherous slope. They were not in a hurry. They were confident. They were predators closing in on their prey. He didn't waste time. He strode back into the cabin, his face a grim mask. "They're here," he said, his voice low and urgent. Wren, who was stoking the morning fire, froze. The color drained from her face, leaving it pale and drawn. She looked at him, her eyes wide with a terror that was stark and absolute. "How many?" she whispered. 3. She closed her eyes, her hand going to her throat. "Caleb," she breathed. "Abel's brother, and his 2 boys." "Get Abel's rifle," Silas commanded, his voice sharp, cutting through her fear. "And stay away from the windows." He moved to the door, his own rifle in his hand. He cracked it open and peered out. The riders were halfway down the slope now, close enough for him to make out their faces. The man in the lead was big, a mountain of a man with a thick black beard and cold, dead eyes. Caleb. The 2 behind him were younger, leaner, with the same cruel set to their mouths. They rode with a swagger, an arrogance that spoke of a lifetime of taking what they wanted. Silas felt a cold, familiar calm settle over him. This was what he was good at. This was the world he understood. The fear, the anticipation, the clean, simple calculus of violence. He was no longer a ghost in someone else's story. He was the gun, and the gun was about to speak. He looked back at Wren. She was standing by the flour bin, the rifle in her hands. She held it awkwardly, as if it were a snake that might bite her. Her hands were shaking. "I can't," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread. "I can't kill another man." "You don't have to kill anyone," Silas said, his voice softening slightly. "You just have to be ready. You just have to show them we're not afraid." He turned back to the door. The riders had reached the bottom of the slope and were fanning out, circling the cabin. They were taking their time, enjoying the fear they were creating. "Wren Alder!" Caleb's voice boomed, a sound like rocks grinding together. "We know you're in there! We've come for what's ours!" Silas raised his rifle, the stock cool and smooth against his cheek. He sighted on Caleb, the big man's chest filling his sights. He could end this right now. 1 shot, 1 clean kill. But that wasn't the plan. The plan was to make them leave, to make them understand that this was not a prize to be taken easily. "He's talking about the money," Wren said from behind him, her voice filled with a bitter loathing. "It's all they've ever cared about." "Stay down," Silas ordered. He took a deep breath, held it, and then squeezed the trigger. The shot was deafening in the small cabin. The bullet kicked up a spray of dirt just in front of Caleb's horse. The animal reared, screaming, and Caleb fought to control it. The two boys drew their own guns, their eyes scanning the cabin, looking for a target. "That was a warning!" Silas yelled, his voice carrying in the still morning air. "The next one won't miss! Ride out now, and you live!" Caleb got his horse under control, his face a mask of fury. He spat on the ground. "You think you can scare us? We're the Alders. We don't scare." He turned to his sons. "Burn her out." One of the boys dismounted, a lit torch in his hand. He started towards the cabin, a slow, deliberate walk. Silas fired again. This time, the bullet hit the torch, sending it spinning through the air, a comet of fire that landed harmlessly in the dirt. The boy yelped and scrambled back to his horse. Caleb laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You're a good shot, stranger, but there's only one of you, and 3 of us." He raised his own rifle. "Last chance. Send the woman out and the money, and we might let you live." Silas knew this was it. The talking was over. The next few seconds would decide everything. He glanced back at Wren. She was still standing by the flour bin, her face ashen, the rifle clutched in her hands. Her eyes were fixed on him, a silent question in their depths. He gave her a curt nod, a signal of reassurance he didn't feel. Then he turned back to the door, his heart a cold, hard knot in his chest. He had been in 100 fights like this. He had faced down men with murder in their eyes and come out alive. But this time was different. This time, he wasn't just fighting for money. He wasn't just fighting for his own life. He was fighting for her, for the woman who had killed her husband with a skillet and served him stew with salt in it that tasted of tears. He raised his rifle, the weight of it familiar and deadly. The world narrowed to the space between his eye and the sight, the space between life and death. He was Silas Ketch. He was a killer, and he was about to go to work. The world exploded in a symphony of chaos. Gunfire erupted from 3 directions, the bullets thudding into the log walls of the cabin, sending splinters of wood flying. Silas returned fire, a steady, methodical rhythm, aiming not to kill, but to disable, to drive them back. He shot the hat off one of the boys, the rifle out of the hands of the other. They were sloppy, arrogant, relying on their numbers and their reputation. They weren't used to someone fighting back. Caleb was different. He was a seasoned fighter, a man who knew the deadly dance of a gunfight. He stayed on his horse, using it for cover, firing with a chilling accuracy. A bullet whizzed past Silas's head, so close he felt the heat of it, and buried itself in the wall behind him. Silas ducked back from the door, his heart hammering against his ribs. This wasn't working. He couldn't hold them off forever. He needed to change the game. He needed an advantage. He looked at Wren. She hadn't moved. She was frozen, her eyes wide with a paralyzing fear. The rifle in her hands was useless. "Wren!" he yelled, his voice raw. "The back window! Give me cover!" His words seemed to break the spell. She blinked, her eyes focusing. She looked at the rifle in her hands, then at him. A flicker of something, a spark of the fire he had first seen in her, returned to her eyes. She nodded, a quick, jerky movement, and ran to the small window at the back of the cabin. Silas took a deep breath and charged out the front door, firing as he went. It was a fool's move, a desperate gamble, but it was the only one he had. He needed to draw their fire, to give Wren a chance. The 2 boys, startled by his sudden appearance, fired wildly. Their bullets went wide, kicking up dust around his feet. Silas dove behind the water trough, the wood splintering as a bullet slammed into it. He risked a glance towards the back of the cabin. Wren was at the window, the rifle raised. She was aiming at Caleb. Caleb, his attention focused on Silas, didn't see her. He was raising his own rifle for a final, killing shot. "Now, Wren!" Silas screamed. The shot from Abel's rifle was a flat, dull crack, different from the sharp report of Silas's gun. It was the sound of the strange, silver dime bullet leaving the barrel. Caleb grunted, a sound of surprise and pain. He looked down at his chest, at the dark stain spreading across his shirt. He looked up at the cabin, his eyes finding Wren in the window. A look of disbelief, of utter confusion, crossed his face. Then he toppled from his horse, a dead weight hitting the ground with a sickening thud. The two boys stared at their father, their faces a mixture of shock and horror. Then they looked at Wren, at the smoking rifle in her hands. The fight went out of them, replaced by a sudden, primal fear. They turned their horses and fled, riding back up the ridge as if the devil himself were on their heels. Silence descended, thick and heavy, broken only by the sound of Silas's own ragged breathing. He stood up slowly, his rifle held loosely in his hands. He looked at Caleb's body, lying still and lifeless in the dirt. He looked at the two retreating figures, already small in the distance. And then he looked at the cabin, at Wren. She was still standing at the window, the rifle clutched to her chest. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and haunted. She had done it. She had killed again, not with a skillet this time, but with a gun, with her husband's gun. He walked towards her, his boots heavy in the dust. He didn't know what to say, what to do. He had pushed her to this. He had put the gun in her hands and told her to shoot. He had saved her life, but he wondered if he had damned her soul. He reached the cabin and looked up at her. She stared back at him, her eyes unreadable. The storm was back, but it was a different kind of storm now. It was a storm of grief, of guilt, of a horror that had no name. He had come to Carrion Ridge to take a life, and in a way he had. He had taken the life Wren had known, the life of a victim, and replaced it with the life of a killer. He had seen the same transformation in himself years ago, the moment when the line between survival and sin had blurred and then vanished altogether. He had thought he was alone on that dark road. Now he had company. He reached up and gently took the rifle from her hands. It was warm from the shot. He looked at her, at the woman who was both his salvation and his ruin. He had won the fight, but he had a terrible feeling that he had lost the war. The silence that stretched between them was no longer empty. It was filled with the ghosts of the men they had killed, with the weight of their shared sins. The days that followed the gunfight were a blur of quiet horror. Silas buried Caleb next to his brother, under the shade of the old oak tree. It felt wrong, laying the two enemies side by side, but the earth didn't discriminate. It took them both, pulling them down into its cold, silent embrace. Wren watched from the porch, her face a pale, emotionless mask. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. She just watched, her eyes as empty as the sky. The two bodies in the ground changed everything. Before, there had been a secret, a single act of desperation that bound them together. Now, there was a conspiracy. They were partners in a crime that could hang them both. The fragile domesticity they had built was shattered, replaced by a tense, watchful silence. They moved around each other like strangers, their shared guilt a wall between them. Silas found himself adrift, his purpose fulfilled, but his presence no longer justified. The threat was gone. Abel's family would not be back. He was free to go. He could take his money, the money Wren had promised him, and ride away. He could leave Carrion Ridge and its ghosts behind him. It was what he should do. It was what the old Silas, the man who had ridden in 3 weeks ago, would have done without a second thought. But he couldn't bring himself to leave. He looked at Wren, at the way she moved through her days like a phantom, her eyes always fixed on some distant point he couldn't see. The fire he had admired in her was gone, extinguished by the second killing. She had saved his life, but in doing so, she had lost a part of herself. He felt a responsibility for that, a debt that couldn't be paid with money. He tried to talk to her, to break through the wall of silence she had built around herself. But his words were clumsy, inadequate. He was a man of action, not of comfort. He knew how to end a life, not how to mend one. One evening, he found her by the fireplace, staring into the flames. The pot of stew was simmering on the hearth, its rich aroma filling the room, but neither of them had any appetite. "You should go," she said, her voice a low, toneless murmur. "There's nothing for you here anymore. I'm not leaving you like this, Ren." She turned to him, and for the first time in days, he saw a flicker of emotion in her eyes. It was a cold, bitter anger. "Like what? A killer? Is that what I am now? Like you?" The words hit him harder than any bullet. He had no defense against them, because they were true. He had made her like him. He had dragged her down into his world of violence and death. "It was self-defense," he said, his voice rough. "They would have killed us both." "It doesn't matter," she whispered, her gaze returning to the fire. "It doesn't change what I did, what we did." She looked at her hands, as if seeing the blood on them. "I see his face when I close my eyes. Caleb's, the surprise. He didn't understand." Silas knew that look. He had seen it on the faces of a dozen men. It was the look of a life being stolen, a story cut short. He had learned to live with it, to bury it deep inside him. But Ren, she was not built for this. She did not have the layers of scar tissue that he had. Her wounds were fresh, and they were festering. He wanted to reach out to her, to touch her, to offer some small comfort. But he didn't know how. The space between them was a chasm, and he was afraid that if he tried to cross it, they would both fall. He spent his days working on the homestead, trying to lose himself in physical labor. He repaired the roof, strengthened the corral, chopped enough wood to last through the winter. He was trying to build something, to create something, in a place that had only known destruction. He was trying to prove to himself, and to her, that he was more than just a killer. One afternoon, while clearing out the small, dilapidated barn, he found it. Tucked away in a dusty corner under a pile of old sacks was a small, wooden chest. It was locked. He pried it open with the tip of his knife. Inside, nestled on a bed of yellowed lace, was a collection of letters, tied with a faded blue ribbon. There was also a small, leather-bound journal. He picked it up, his fingers tracing the worn cover. He knew he shouldn't. It was an invasion of privacy, a violation of the trust that was already so fragile between them. But he couldn't help himself. He needed to understand. He needed to know the truth of this place, the truth of the man she had killed. He opened the journal. The handwriting was neat, precise, a woman's hand. It was Ren's. He started to read. The journal began years ago, filled with the hopes and dreams of a young woman starting a new life. She wrote of her love for Abel, of her excitement at building a home with him on the ridge. The early entries were full of light and laughter, of picnics by the creek and plans for the future. But then, slowly, the tone began to change. The light faded, replaced by shadows. She wrote of Abel's moods, his sudden, terrifying rages that came from nowhere. She wrote of his jealousy, his possessiveness, his growing obsession with the small inheritance her father had left her. She wrote of the loneliness, the isolation, the feeling of being a prisoner in her own home. And then she wrote about the ridge. She described a growing sense of unease, a feeling of being watched. She wrote of strange sounds in the night, of shadows moving at the edge of her vision. Abel felt it too. He became convinced that something was living on the ridge, something ancient and malevolent. He called it the debt collector, a phrase that sent a chill down Silas's spine. He started carrying the rifle everywhere, the rifle loaded with silver dimes. He became convinced that the thing on the ridge was after his soul, a debt he had incurred long ago. The journal entries became more frantic, more desperate. Ren wrote of her fear, not just of Abel, but of the thing that was driving him mad. She was trapped between a monster in her house and a monster on the ridge. The last entry was dated the day before Silas arrived. It was short, just a few lines, scrawled in a shaky hand. He knows I sent for help. He says no one is coming. He says the ridge won't let them. Tonight, He will take what is his, the money, or my life. I have the skillet on the stove. It is heavy. God forgive me. Silas closed the journal, his hands trembling. He finally understood the whole terrible story, the fear, the desperation, the final brutal act of survival. He had misjudged her. He had seen her as a manipulator, a woman playing a game. But she was just a victim, pushed to the absolute limit of her endurance. He picked up the letters. They were from Abel, but they weren't addressed to Wren. They were addressed to another woman, a woman in a town 2 counties away. They were love letters, filled with promises of a new life, of escape from the prison on the ridge. They spoke of the money he would soon have, enough for them to start over, to be free. The pieces clicked into place, forming a picture of such profound betrayal and cruelty that it took Silas's breath away. Abel hadn't been driven mad by some phantom on the ridge. He had been driven mad by his own greed. The story of the debt collector was a lie, a performance to terrorize Wren, to isolate her, to break her spirit so he could take her money and leave. He had been planning to murder her. She had just killed him first. Silas sat in the dusty barn, the letters and the journal in his hands, and felt a rage so pure and cold it was like a shard of ice in his heart. He had killed men for less. So much less. He stood up and walked back to the cabin, his purpose clear. He had to tell her. He had to show her what he had found. He had to set her free from the guilt that was destroying her. He found her on the porch, staring out at the ridge as the sun began to set. He stood beside her, the journal and the letters in his hand. "I found these," he said, his voice quiet. "In the barn." She looked at the items in his hand, her face unreadable. She didn't move to take them. "You should read them," he said. "You should know the truth." "I know the truth," she said, her voice flat. "I'm a killer." "No," he said, his voice fierce. "You're a survivor." He told her everything, about the letters, about Abel's plan, about the lies he had told. He watched her face as he spoke, watched the slow dawn of understanding in her eyes, the flicker of disbelief, the dawning of a terrible, liberating truth. When he was finished, she was silent for a long time. The sun had set, and the sky was a canvas of bruised purple and orange. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. It was the first tear he had seen her shed since the gunfight. "All this time," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "All this time I thought I was the monster." "The only monster on this ridge is buried under that tree," Silas said, his voice soft. She looked at him then, her eyes shining in the twilight. The wall between them, the wall of guilt and silence, had crumbled. In its place was something new, something fragile and uncertain, but something real. It was a shared understanding, a shared absolution. She reached out and took his hand. Her fingers were cold, but her grip was strong. "Thank you, Silas," she whispered. He looked down at their joined hands, at the way her fingers fit between his. He felt a warmth spread through him, a warmth that had nothing to do with food or fire. It was a feeling he hadn't known he was capable of, a feeling he had spent his whole life running from. It was the feeling of connection, of belonging. He had come to Carrion Ridge to do a job. He had stayed to protect a woman. But now, as he stood on the porch, her hand in his, he realized that he had found something he hadn't even known he was looking for. A reason to stay, a reason to live, a reason to be more than just a killer. The future was a blank page, an unknown country. He didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know if they could ever truly escape the ghosts of their past. But for the first time in a long, long time, he felt a flicker of hope. The stew had gone cold, but her eyes hadn't.